Hi guys, about a month ago I had a comment on one of my videos that was pretty hilarious, and they were requesting a video on inventory management. I wanted to wait a while until I had quite a bit of items to go through before attempting this video, and I think I'm at a point now where I really need some space. So I'm going to teach you how to go through your stash and manage your inventory better. There's a few things you need to keep in mind while you're managing your inventory. Realistic expectations. Give yourself expectations of builds you actually want to play with and builds you know you'll just never be interested in playing. If you hate sniping, that's going to open up a lot of possible space in your stash. The same thing applies to all other aspects of the game. If you dislike playing support builds, there's multiple gear sets, weapons, and even gear and performance mods that can be completely ruled out when you're looking at your stash. Duplicate items. Ask yourself if you already have that item on your character. Do you really need another one? If the answer is yes, you already have the item, and you have no intention on using two of them, get rid of that item. It might be difficult because it's a god-rolled item, but trust me, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache. Useful items. Is the item actually useful? This is what a lot of new players struggle with today, because they don't know what items are actually good or bad. They don't know what the highest percentage rolls are, or what mods are going to be useful for the builds they want to make later. I'm going to break down the inventory management process into 4 different steps, and all of those steps are going to be utilizing these 3 criterias. First step, arrange your gear. This process is the most time-consuming and can be really frustrating sometimes. I find it's easiest to move all gear pieces of the same set onto one character. If you have multiple of the same builds across all characters and want to compare all of that gear together, I'd recommend deleting the loadout itself and moving the gear from that loadout to the stash and then to the character of your choice to compare all of the gear items. I personally like to keep all weapons, weapon mods, and gear mods in the stash as long as there's room for them. If your weapons are attached to your loadout, you of course don't need to put those into your stash, but I would still recommend removing the attachments from the loadout to compare the weapon attachments later. If you have no room to move anything, you can go through your gear, performance, and weapon mods that are usually at the bottom of your stash, and equip those mods to gear and weapons that are inside your stash. This will usually give you more space to work with. If you don't have any room to move anything, you have to skip to step 2. Remember to use realistic expectations. If you have gear that you know very well you're never going to be using, do yourself a favor and delete that gear now. If you hate sniping, delete any sentry, Hunter's Faith, or Deadeye pieces, as well as sniper rifles. If you hate playing skill builds, delete any tactician pieces, or mods with electronics and skill power rolls. The same thing goes for weapons. If you hate LMGs and shotguns, delete any of those weapons and Lone Star pieces with them. The only exception to this is if you want to play with 2 to 3 piece bonuses. If you're a new player, it's going to take some time for you to know what to keep and what to delete. As you play, you'll begin to learn what playstyle suits you best for builds that you make, and which guns you'd like to use the most. If you have an idea already of what you would like to play and are able to delete some gear sets or weapons early on, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache in the next step. I personally like to scrap any classified gear instead of selling them. If you're full on fabric, scrapping classified gear will still give you 1 division tech. Remember to remove any mods from the item that you scrap, so you don't accidentally scrap the mods with it. Then put those mods into the stash to compare later. Step 2. Compare your gear. Start with one character, and I like to look at one gear set at a time. Keep in mind what builds you want to make in the near future that you're still farming for pieces for. For example, I know that I want to make a Sentry's Call build, but I'm still looking for a backpack. So I moved all of my sentry pieces onto the character that I want to put the Sentry's Call build on. Since I only plan on making one Sentry's Call build on one character, and don't plan to make the same build on others, I will make sure to leave only one sentry piece and scrap any duplicates. Continue comparing pieces to each other until you've found the best of the bunch. Keep in mind the kind of rolls that you want to have on the gear, and take the gear score of the item into mind. Will it cost you more resources to make one piece better over the other? Will it cost you more credits? This kind of ties into knowing on if the item is useful or not. It's a better idea to keep the piece that you won't have to spend as much time and resources to make pretty. I can't really get into which attributes are good or bad right now, but I do go over some of this in my gear breakdown video, and I will link that in the description. As you get into this process, you'll start to find pieces and you aren't even sure why you saved them to begin with. Remember that this game is done with its updates. Holding on to things that you think might be useful later is not necessary. The gear will never change, so you won't have to worry about that. Weapons, exotics, and mods can be a little more complicated to compare, so I like to leave them for the end. The more classified pieces that you go through and delete, the more room you're going to have in your stash and on your characters to place weapons and mods to compare later. You can also attach your spare weapon parts to the exotic weapons in your stash to save more room while you go through this process of deleting classified pieces. Then when you're ready to compare the weapons and the attachments, you can just attach those later on. Once you're done comparing your gear, it's time to move on to step 3. Compare your weapons and attachments. This can be really tricky, because weapons are something that you like to switch up every now and again. However, there is a fairly significant gap between good and bad weapons. This mostly comes down to keeping useful weapons and getting rid of useless ones. I go over this quite a bit in my weapon tier list video, so I'll link that in the description as well. Like gear, weapons and their attachments also have an item level, the highest level being 34. Unfortunately, there's no way to actually see the item's level once you actually have it in your possession. It will always show level 30, even if it's higher than that. The only way to tell what level your weapon attachments actually are is by looking at the percentage number. I'll be linking a Google Doc in the description where you can check out the bracket of the percentages to tell if it's levels 30 through 34. Weapons may take some time for you to compare and filter out because you do have to factor weapon talents into your comparison. This is why I like to mostly reserve my stash for weapons instead of classified gear. You will more than likely have multiple weapons on standby on your character as well, until you have an understanding of what weapons belong on each of your builds. And sometimes you may just feel like changing it up a bit, which is fine. So having that extra space in your inventory can make a big difference. Once you know which weapons that you want to keep or delete, you can move on to your attachments. There's 2 different ways that you can compare your weapon modifications. You can either attach one of them to your weapon and go through each of the same weapon attachment type and see if it changes your firepower to a higher number, but I would not recommend this method. Instead, I would recommend comparing them side by side and looking at the actual percentage numbers. This is because your firepower number does not always accurately show how much damage your weapon actually has. Oftentimes, it's taking things into account like reload speed and rate of fire, which will ultimately increase your damage per second, but not the base damage of your weapon. I'll keep this as easy as possible by saying that you only ever really need 2 of the same weapon attachments per character. This is because if you change your build, the attachment that's equipped to your other loadout will automatically remove itself from the other weapon when you change it to a different loadout that you have it saved to. For example, if you have an extended magazine equipped to an SMG in one loadout, and you want to use the same magazine on another weapon in a different loadout, you can absolutely do that. It will automatically attach itself to whichever weapon is tied to that loadout that you are equipping. The only time that you should keep more of the same attachment is if you really care about the minor attributes. For example, you could have 2 SR7 suppressors that both have 19% critical hit damage, but one has headshot damage and critical hit chance, the other one has optimal range and accuracy. If you care about those 2 attributes being different and you want to utilize them both in different situations or builds, by all means keep both of them. They're both really good suppressors, and if they're attached to 2 separate weapons, they won't take up any inventory space. Just make sure to lock your attachments so you don't accidentally scrap or sell them. And remember, you should always keep the highest level of weapon attachment unless you have no others available to you. In that case, you can settle for a lower percentage. If you need help finding out if your weapon attachment is at its max percentage, I'll attach that link in the description for the Google document to refer to. Moving on to step 4. Compare your gear mods. There's actually quite a few mods in the game to filter out, but it's pretty easy to determine which ones are actually useful versus the ones that aren't useful. For example, all resistance gear mods in general are pretty useless, but exotic damage resilient mods are great to have. The primary stat number is also important to look at when determining if the mod is useful or not. If the primary stat is less than 250, it's really not worth keeping unless you don't have anything better. If you have a lot of 250 plus mods, bump the requirement up to 260. The highest number you can reach for mods is 267 for the primary stat number. You also need to consider the major attribute for your mod. Even if you have a 260 plus primary stat mod, the major attribute could be useless. For example, you could have a 265 firearms mod, but the majority attribute could be something like 2800 skill power. It's not terrible, but the attribute could be a lot higher. You also need to consider which mods you will actually see yourself putting to use on specific builds. There are some mods that you will more than likely never use because it does not match the needs for the build you want to make. If you want to keep some of those mods on standby because you just aren't sure if you're going to be using them later or not, no problem. Just keep 5 of the best mods total, if they're gear mods, to equip on your chest piece, mask, knee pads, and backpack. And if they're performance mods, just hold on to 4 of the best types and delete the rest. If you're having trouble comparing the mods side by side, you can try equipping them to a gear piece and scrolling through the same mods to find out which ones are better than the ones you currently have equipped. For example, you'll see I'm looking through all of my stamina and skill power mods in the background. Since I have so many of them, I'm just equipping one to a gear piece that I have on, and scrolling through all of the others to see if there's any of them that are better than the one I have equipped. You'll know for sure because the stat numbers at the top will show increased green numbers next to your primary build stats. If you stick with the 3 criterias of giving yourself realistic expectations, getting rid of duplicate items, and knowing what items are useful, you're going to find yourself with a lot more stash space than when you started. And that's pretty much it. If you go through this process, you're going to find yourself deleting a lot of unnecessary equipment, therefore increasing the amount of space you have in your stash. It also helps to create multiple characters. Back in the day, I used to have a 4th character that I basically used as a mule to put all of the leftover exotics and whatnot that I have. Hopefully this video was helpful for you guys though. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I promise to answer them. But I will see you guys in the next video.